Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Fasken webinar today, Disconnecting from Work, New, Old, and Potential Considerations for Employers. We're so pleased that you could join us. Speaking of connection, being connected this way online from across the country and elsewhere today. While I do just a very brief introduction for our panelists today, please see the information that is on your screen with respect to some of the housekeeping items for today, including closed captioning, surveys, and materials, and whether you need any technical support during our webinar this morning or this afternoon. My name is Marc Rodrigue. I'm a partner in Fasken's Labor, Employment, and Human Rights Group based in Toronto, and I'm joined today, so pleased to be joined by my fellow Toronto colleagues, Avneet, Jaswal, and Vincent, Rocheleau, both associates with our Labor, Employment, and Human Rights Group, and both who've had the pleasure to digest and understand and appreciate the various disconnecting from work requirements that we face across the country and in one province right now in particular. Now on to our presentation. We're going to cover a full set of topics today, starting with a bit of a background on what we're talking about with disconnecting from work and some of the situations we see in other jurisdictions and some of the movement inside Canada in terms of disconnecting from work requirements. We're going to spend a good amount of time this afternoon, in particular, focusing on Ontario's new requirements for a policy on disconnecting from work and some ideas now that this will be a requirement for many employers by June 2nd of this year to have a policy, some ideas on what you should look at in terms of drafting your policy. If you have a policy already, this will be a good refresher, maybe to put some fresh eyes on that policy. If you need to come up with a policy and haven't yet, of course, we always encourage you to reach out to your Fasken lawyers, but there's some considerations we'll talk about today that you should think about as you're putting that policy together. And we're going to end today with a refresher, because although we keep hearing disconnecting from work, and there certainly has been legislation and talk around this, I think it's a good opportunity now. We are over 2 years into a dramatic shift in the way that the world of work has been for us, with a rise of remote work, a rise of flexible work arrangements. And in many respects, we've had to do these situations on the fly with little to no notice. And going forward, I know we're all sitting here thinking of what does the future of our work cycle and work culture look like? Well, it's a good time to remind ourselves that there are already some rules in place across the country that we could say are about disconnecting from work. And as we move from models, particularly in an office environment where folks are showing up 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, that situation we know has changed. With people working remotely, the ebbs and flows of the workday have changed too. So let's remind ourselves what the requirements are today. And we'll talk about a couple of cases as well that serve as a great reminder for us that we still have obligations to meet in respect of, even if we don't have to have a disconnecting from work policy, there are base obligations for us to continue to meet as employers. Next slide. So let's start here. Spoiler alert, the question is disconnecting from work a buzz phrase or a culture shift? And as we'll see on the next slide, I tend to think that we're talking culture shifts and not just a one-off buzzword when it comes to folks prioritizing disconnecting from work, work-life balance, work-life flow, whichever buzzwords you want to use around it. There certainly is a growing consciousness, I think, both in the public eye and in the media and among our workforces around how many hours of work am I putting in any given week. As I said, during the pandemic, we've seen certainly a rise in hours of work. About a year ago right now, ADP in Canada reported that over 30% of folks in the workforce were indicating that with working from home in particular, they were working more hours. And around that same time, we have the World Health Organization publishing some data. At that time, it was a little stale. They looked at data from 2014 to 2018 and noticed as well a rise in the hours of work, particularly in North America and Europe. So much so that they determined, and this is a startling stat, that those that worked more than 55 hours in a week were at a 35% higher risk of stroke and a 17% higher risk of heart disease compared to those who worked 35 to 40 hours per week. So there's continuing to be some thought on how much folks are working out there. And just 2 weeks ago, LifeWorks published the survey on a mental health index. And you can see some of the stats that we've pulled from that survey. And it's right on point for what we're talking about today. So they had 28% of Canadians or respondents to their survey indicate that they weren't able to disconnect after their regular work hours. And a quarter of those folks put the blame on their managers, contacting them after hours and expecting responses. And not surprisingly, and perhaps those of us that are on this webinar today can read the next stat and either sympathize or empathize. But the response that LifeWorks had to some questions was that 42% of Canadians are ending their workdays feeling mentally or physically exhausted. And of course, as you can see, that's had an impact on the mental health of those who responded. One last stat I want to flag for you, because as we go forward and you think about how you're going to implement any disconnecting from work policies or culture change or expectations around responding after hours or being connected after hours, you can see this last stat. Those younger than 40 are significantly higher to report being unable to disconnect after regular work hours than those over 50. And so that might inform some of the approaches we take, particularly with respect to practical steps and practical implementation of trying to protect folks off work hours. On to the next slide. Now, I say again, this isn't a buzzword, but rather something I think that's here to stay. And when we talk about Canada, inside Canada, looking at where is the action on disconnecting from work policies, you can see going right back to 2018, and we could go back further, but we'll stop there. So pre-pandemic, you've had twice in Quebec so far, private members' bills introduced 2018 and again last year to create some rights about disconnecting from work and quite hardline rights about when employees are allowed to be disconnected, what they're allowed to push back against, and what fines, frankly, might be imposed for an employer intervening in an employee's disconnected hours. We've also seen some action at the federal level. We'll go into that in some detail, dating back to 2019 with the Minister of Labor getting a mandate letter directing the minister to look at what should be done at a federal level for disconnecting from work requirements. And finally, and this is what we'll talk about for the bulk of our presentation, and we all know this now, Bill 27 came into law in December. And in Ontario, come June 2nd of this year, many employers will have a requirement to have a policy now on disconnecting from work. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Vincent, who's just going to give us an interesting refresher that this is not just simply a Canadian or North American function. There's actually been quite some robust movement on disconnecting from work policies in Europe.
Thank you, Marc. So the whole question of disconnecting from work, like many of the more employee-friendly policies, have started in European jurisdictions. Now, different countries have taken different approaches on implementing a potential right to disconnect policy. And nevertheless, the idea did start in France, Spain, and Italy, where these were the first countries to introduce legislation which granted workers the right not to respond to work-related communications after their core hours and prohibited employees from being penalized for doing this. And so after France, Italy, and Spain, Ireland, Sweden, and Belgium addressed the topic. Germany took a different approach, In that country, the changes were implemented by companies rather than law, with stakeholders of key German companies entering into negotiations about what policies to implement to ensure that employees were able to disconnect. That being said, we haven't seen any movement in the UK or in the US on this. And I have a feeling that if there's going to be movement anywhere, those will be the last countries where we'll see movement. And so the next slides, I briefly go over the movements in the European countries I mentioned before. So in France, employers have to negotiate an agreement with union representatives on the right to disconnect outside of work hours. The law doesn't impose rules on how employees should switch off. Instead, it requires the companies in which trade unions have a union section, typically companies with about 50 employees, to enter into a mandatory annual negotiation to define how staff can exercise the right to disconnect. And if no agreement with the unions reach, adopt a unilateral charter in this respect after consulting their work councils. These negotiations must also cover the establishment of arrangements to regulate the use of digital equipment in order to ensure compliance with the rest and holiday periods and to protect personal life and family life. Spain took a very similar approach. In that country, companies are obligated to come up with a policy to be negotiated with employee representatives, including measures to allow the employees to digitally disconnect. While the regulation does not include the specific actions that need to be taken, companies have taken a variety of measures. For example, the right not to respond to emails, phone, instant messages was one of them. Others adopted rules that prevented managers from requesting a response outside of work time. And others have chosen to require companies to set up meetings between a certain period of time. Now, in Italy, the legislator introduced the right for employees working remotely to disconnect from the company tools and system used to carry out their work. Notably, this only recognized the right to disconnect for employees on the smart working models, meaning employees alternating between working in the office and working remotely, as opposed to someone on a teleworking contract or someone who's based permanently at home. So this was very much reserved for people who had a sort of hybrid model between work and home. On the next slide, I cover Ireland, Belgium, and the European Parliament legislation. So in Ireland, a completely different approach again. The code encourages employers to create a culture of good work-life balance and alleviates employees from the expectation of responding to messages outside of hours. It's not legally binding, but it was built on the foundation of existing legal obligations in Ireland, such as the 48-hour work week, health and safety obligations, and the right to a statement of key terms setting out working hours. In Ireland, the right was recently introduced through a new code of practice, making it one of the first countries to introduce such a measure since the COVID-19 pandemic. I would stipulate that Canada followed. In Belgium, each employer must consult with the Health and Safety Committee about disconnecting and the use of digital communication tools. The measures decided on should then be confirmed in the company's work rules and policies or a collective bargaining agreement or even a policy. Belgium's legislation does not grant a right to disconnect, but rather a right to address and discuss the issue. And most recently on the European ground, as of January 21st, 2021, the European Parliament passed a legislative initiative on the right to disconnect. The initiative recommends implementing an EU directive that allows those who work digitally to disconnect outside their work hours without facing any adverse consequences. And the directive requires that there be minimum requirements for remote working and clarifying working conditions, working hours, and rest periods. And so we see that different countries in the EU have adopted different rules and have different views of how this should be approached, but there is definitely a trend in having something on this topic. And now I'll pass it over to Avneet.
Thanks, Vincent. So consistent with what we've seen across the globe and how Vincent has just explained in terms of other jurisdictions, the federal jurisdiction has also considered the concept of the right to disconnect. And it was first proposed as an addition to the Canada Labour Code approximately 4 years ago. And it came out of this, the concern with addressing employee mental health. However, after 1 year of consultation, the advisory committee that had been assigned to address this issue decided not to propose any formal legislative changes at the time. And while there was a general consensus that there should be some parameters placed on work-related communication outside regular work hours, there was a strong opposition to formally regulate these restrictions. So instead, a right to disconnect advisory committee was formed to provide recommendations to the minister on how to implement a workplace mandate that would address some of the concerns that the government was trying to mitigate against. So the right to disconnect advisory committee, listened to various opinions and reviews from people, from employers, unions, workers, and so forth, and came up with a final report. And the final report was released in February of 2022, so just recently. And it includes a series of recommendations based on all the information that the committee had obtained. And so we'll just go to the next slide. So some of the key points that came out of the report was that employees should be paid for work performed, whether that's during working hours or outside of normal working hours. And there should be an emphasis on a positive work-life balance. That should be the key goal of not just employees, but employers and everyone involved in the work relationship. This concept of flexibility, I think it's something that Marc has touched on. It's obviously, that's the shift that everyone is moving towards, is these flexible work arrangements. I think COVID has made that very clear that it's an important and vital aspect of the working relationship. So, maintaining that is something that was definitely considered as a part of the recommendations. And absolute limits may not be realistic. There are various types of operations 24/7, around the clock. And so having specific work hours or absolute limits are not feasible for every workplace. And another point was that there was a need to recognize the varied nature of the federal jurisdiction as it differs from other types of jurisdictions in the country. So that was the positive and the key points that everyone agreed on. So there were also parts of the report where there wasn't a consensus and that those issues that came up were the type of requirements or obligations, the level of degree or involvement that these restrictions would have on the workplace, and then timing on when to implement these types of mandates and when they should be rolled out, and also the impact of COVID and consideration on timings, because there's a lot of workforces that are trying to now ramp back up as restrictions are lifting. And so there were a lot of things that couldn't be agreed on. And one key thing that came out of this was obviously the varying opinions and the differences in opinion between employers and unions. And we can move on to the next slide. So naturally, employers are advocating for flexible requirements that will not only promote work-life balance, but acknowledge the realities of business operations. And further, employers emphasize the fact, and Marc touched on this earlier, that there are existing provisions in the Canada Labour Code that already essentially create a right to disconnect from work for employees. For example, limit on hours of work. There are, mandated resting periods and other rules that essentially provide employees with an actual right to disconnect. And we'll discuss these a little bit later on as well. And on the other side, we had unions and nonprofit government organizations that were advocating that for robust and mandated requirements for workplaces to establish an enforceable right to disconnect. The position is that a total voluntary approach will not work. And their position is that the law as it currently stands Workers' livelihoods are dependent on their employers, and there could be penalized for exercising their right to disconnect, especially if these policies are voluntary or not a requirement. Furthermore, there was this emphasis on the fact that non-unionized employees may not have the same rights as unionized employees, and therefore, these policies would protect those employees. And therefore, a statutory requirement was necessary when it came to the right to disconnect. So as you can see, these are two very varying viewpoints. And ultimately, the committee decided that it was not going to, at least at this point in time, create a legal obligation. So if we can just move on to the next slide. So what this means now for federally regulated employers is, like I just said, currently there's no legal obligation to implement any of the recommendations that have come out of the final report, nor is there a requirement to implement a formal disconnect from work policy. But that doesn't mean that this right cannot arise in the future. The government obviously, is likely to consider this report and consider how to move forward with the recommendations that came out. So, there's a few things that employers can do, and that's consider whether they voluntarily want to implement such policies. As we noted before, there is a shift towards this concept of disconnecting from work. So employers may want to consider whether it's having a formal policy or having discussions with managers to encourage discussions with employees on, flexible work arrangements, what's working, what's not working, and creating informal parameters between in the workforce. Or it may be, what might work for places, formalizing these requirements into a policy. But one thing is for sure, having some consideration as an employer to this concept of disconnecting from work could help improve employee morale and foster positive employee relations. We are seeing, as Marc had mentioned, a lot of people feel overworked. They feel that they're working more hours, and their hours are not so set. So this could definitely help at least open that dialogue and create a situation where you can help foster and boost employee morale. But I just want to keep one thing. I want to bring one thing to the forefront. We want to be mindful when we are implementing any right to disconnect policy or guidelines in the workplace. The fact that as it stands now, there's no current right to disconnect from work as these types of policies generally speak to. However, the policy could create such a right. So you want to make sure that when you're drafting these policies, if the intent is not to create a greater right or benefit, but it's more to create a dialogue in the workplace, or at least encourage certain behavior, that you don't draft a policy that may inadvertently create such a right. So you just want to be mindful, and I'm sure Marc will talk to this when we get to his section, but just wanted to just bring that to your forefront, that, that's where maybe, it's helpful to have these policies reviewed by either internal legal counsel or, your Fasken lawyers here, we're happy to help. But essentially, we want to make sure that you don't create a greater right. If that's not the intent, that you don't create a greater right or benefit than what is already legislated in the Canada Labour Code. But like I said, we'll discuss that a little bit later on, but just wanted to bring that to the forefront.
Great. So let's talk about where we are now. So we have seen, like I said, in Quebec in 2018, a private members bill seek to establish some rights to disconnect. That private members bill didn't go anywhere at the end of the day. We've seen, as Avneet said, at the federal level, there has been some significant action to think on and bring together stakeholders to advise the government on disconnecting from work and what that means. And we've had some joint recommendations. Obviously, as Avneet mentioned, there's not a consensus necessarily on how rigid the requirements ought to be. And then, as I said, again, we've seen in Quebec another private members bill be introduced in December of last year that is still on the books and still proceeding through the legislative process. It may ultimately go nowhere. As we know, most private members' bills tend not to get much traction, but keeping in mind, at least in Quebec and looking at other provinces, that these buzzwords, these issues are being put on the front burner. And in Ontario, we've seen the most rigid and legislated form of disconnecting from work requirements, at least expressly, in Bill 27. So let's talk about what this means. The Bill 27 is disconnecting from work policy for employers. We're going to start first with some of the actual requirements, go through requirements, what needs to be in our policy, and who does it apply to. And then we're going to get into a little bit more of some considerations on how we draft this policy and as we're putting it together. So, top line, as Avneet says, the one thing for everybody to keep in mind, the government's requirement, the Bill 27 requirement, is to have a policy about disconnecting from work. It did not create a new or standalone employee right or employer obligation to have anyone disconnected from work at any time. Again, we're going to get into other provisions that might do that already, but this did not create a standalone right. It only required that there be a policy. And let me tell you, if folks complain to, say, the Ministry of Labor that the employer has contravened this new disconnecting from work obligation, what I expect the Ministry of Labor is going to do when they reach out to employers in Ontario is to say, show me a copy of your policy and let's make sure it has the things that need to be in there. And if it does, it doesn't really matter what else it says. It's a check mark, green light, no contravention. So we know that these policies will apply to folks or to employers who have 25 or more employees as of January 1st of a given year. And it's being new legislation, of course, we haven't had much interpretation on it yet. It certainly hasn't landed itself in front of the Ontario Labour Relations Board, which, for those of you not familiar with the Ontario Employment Standards Framework, is typically where cases will end if they appeal all the way through a process. But we know it's going to be 25 or more employees. And there's other areas in case law surrounding Ontario's employment standards about what that means. 25 employees, do we mean 25 employees in Ontario? Do we mean 25 employees in the business writ large? There's conflicting case law in other areas, like I said, about who does this apply to. I suspect it just means 25 employees in Ontario. But if we're close to that and we've got employees elsewhere, well, maybe we want to be proactive and get this policy in place anyway. Now, it's only going to be applicable by law to employees that are in Ontario. So let's make sure that we make that clear if we need to, and particularly if we're going to plunk this policy into any corporate handbooks or intranets where we're deciding we're not going to make this universally applicable, that we're simply going to put it where it is required, which is in this province. We'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. Now, we are required to give a copy of the policy to all employees. And if we update the policy at any given point, we need to give them an updated copy within 30 days of it being published. We will need to also retain a copy of the policy on disconnecting from work for 3 years after it's no longer in effect. So if we update the policy, the old policy, we need to keep somewhere for the next 3 years in case anybody comes looking for it, i.e. the Ministry of Labor. Let's go to the next slide. So again, I said this applies to employers who have 25 or more employees in Ontario on January 1st of any year. And for this first year, we are being given until June the 2nd of this year to come up and implement our policies. If on Jan 1 of this year you had 25 employees, we were given that grace period of all the way to the beginning of next month. Going forward, if you're in a growth period and you're sitting on 20 employees now, and over the course of this year you hire 6 more, we hit the 25 employee threshold. Well, come Jan 1 of next year, you're going to be given 30 days to get a policy in place and out to employees. You don't have to do it in year. It's going to be Jan 1 is your date to look around and see how many employees we have and whether or not this applies. Now, when we talk employees, just to make it clear, all employees count, right? So if I've got full-timers, if I've got part-timers, if I have casuals employed on January 1st, and I hit that 25 employee threshold, we're into this requirement. On to the next. The legislation doesn't give us much in terms of exactly what needs to be in that policy, but it does give us two pieces that I think are key for us to consider. One is a definition of what it means to be disconnecting from work. And you've got it on your screen here, but generally speaking, it means not engaging in work-related communications, including emails, telephone calls, video calls, or sending or reviewing other messages, to be free from the performance of work. So adding this into our employment standards legislation has given us, I think, two key pieces of clarity. I'm going to discuss it a little bit more, but you can see being free from the performance of work, we can all get that. Showing up to the factory, showing up to the office, driving the truck, doing the hallmarks of traditional in-person work. Obviously, that's work. But what this definition might also be suggesting to us, to make it very clear, and this is something we can look at already, whether or not we've got a policy requirement, it suggests that going forward, we want to make sure it's clear that answering an email, taking a telephone call, doing a video call, those are all that are work related. Those are all work, right? So if I'm answering a call or an email at 11 p.m. at night, that's work. And we should continue to think about this as we talk about where are our current limits on hours of work, overtime, call-in pay, all of those things where we've got statutory obligations, let alone in our employment contracts, they may say something even better than statute in terms of employee rights. The other thing that we need to have in our policy in terms of actual content, we need to have the date in there that the policy was prepared. And if we amend the policy at any point, we need to add that in when the amendment dates were. So we're creating a record of when the policy was created and when amendments were created. Now, in terms of the Employment Standards Act requirements, this is the first time that this requirement has been inserted into the Employment Standards Act in terms of record keeping and keeping a clear line of sight on when policies are prepared and when they're amended. It's not a bad thing, up to now to do that by practice. Now the government is actually requiring us to do that within our policy documents, with this policy in particular. So let's move to the next slide. So another piece to consider here, that your policy actually needs to apply to all employees. At this stage, there are no exceptions to that rule. Unlike other provisions in the ESA, where we've seen by regulation, the government exempt, for example, managers or lawyers from hours of work provisions or other provisions that other employees would get as a base entitlement. There are no exceptions to this policy and no guidance from the government otherwise to say that any employee should be considered exempt from the policy. And of course, that's going to have implications on how we draft the policy. That means that, keep in mind, it means that managers or executives, any professionals that we have on staff will fall under this policy, however we draft it up. Next slide. So that's it. I mean, that in a nutshell are the legislative requirements for us. It's not a long list of things that we need to cover, of course. And so the government of Ontario has left it to us to decide how we are going to write these things up. How are we going to come up with a policy that, has, and I'd recommend you just use the definition from the Act. There's no reason to create our own definition for fear that we go further than we need to, or we get it wrong. But we use the definition from the Act. It applies to all employees. But the Act and the policy does not say anywhere, or doesn't have to say anywhere, that these are the absolute rights of someone to disconnect from work, that there's a hard stop at 5 p.m. and a hard start at 9 a.m. It doesn't say that. And so we're left to our own devices as employers to come up with, okay, how are we going to do this and how are we going to implement it? So let's start from the basis. There is no right. at least under this provision and these new requirements, to disconnect from work. We have to have a policy about it. What that policy says is up to us. That being said, when we draft the policy, we've got to think, and Avneet touched about this, of the legal implications of our policies. Now, policies, we see it as lawyers on a day-to-day basis when particularly we have a breakdown in an employment relationship. And we were constantly pointing to policies as creating base entitlements and commitments from the employer on how things are going to proceed and what rights might be available from the employer to employees. And so we've got to be careful about how we craft this, because whatever we put into this policy, that is the standard we are going to be held to. So as we're crafting it, we should be making sure that what we put in here, we can live up to. And that means when we talk about what we're putting in there, we've got to consider, what does our work environment need? Does it need flexibility? Does it need rigidity? What are we doing now? Where are we misstepping perhaps? And we'll get into that when we talk about already existing entitlements for employees. But where are we now? Now, I'm going to posit to you all that this being a brand new policy, we've never seen this in Canada. Of course, our politicians and policymakers are looking over at European models and different ways that they've done it. In Ontario, they've chosen that we have to have a policy. But I'm going to posit to you that for most of us, at least to start with, having flexibility in this policy is probably the right way to go. The government has already considered that we're going to have iterations of this policy, and it's going to create some dialogue, sometimes maybe uncomfortable dialogue, about expectations and hours of work and workplace culture. But flexibility is the name of the game. So I don't want, typically, I'd say most of us are not going to want to say, you need not answer any emails after 5 p.m. You need not answer any phone calls on the weekend. What might be a more appropriate drafting or more appropriate messaging in your policy is to say, look, and this is in line with what we're seeing in some of these studies and concerning stats, we respect that we want our employees to be well. We want our employees to disconnect from work. And this is what disconnecting from work means as best we can, and so we're going to create a culture where we're going to do our best around that. And that might be, putting folks on notice, like there may be times, of course, that we need you to answer. There may be times that there are emergencies. There may be times where we're short-staffed and need to call people in. There may be times that you've got a particular knowledge that we need to bring to bear to meet client needs or operational needs. And so making sure people are aware that we're not going to do things where unnecessary. But there might also be some piece in here in terms of flexibility to look at our own workplace culture and look at these stats around managers being the ones to call employees at night or continue communicating with employees at night. And maybe there are going to be certain steps in our policy or recommendations separately from our policy to our leadership around taking that email and turning on the delay delivery button, right? So the email doesn't land at 11 p.m., but it lands at 9 a.m. the next day. Still allows for the flexibility of the manager to send it. But we've got tips and tricks to try to make sure the communications are arriving during our regular working hours, whatever those may be, right? And then again, setting expectations for those that are managers or executives or professionals, who may have a very different business need and operational needs and input than other employees. So again, we know that this policy has to apply to everyone. And so we want flexibility to say, look, we'll do our best and we hope vacation time is vacation time and whichever, but we're putting people on notice that this may happen and we'll do our best, right? To not contact you when we're trying not to contact you and protect your time off. So I think flexibility for most of us is going to be the name of our game, and if we do decide that we're going to put any rigid lines into our policy about, no contact after this, or we shall do this, then we've got to be prepared to live up to it, because I can foresee a future in which, of course, we're, as HR professionals in particular, we're facing claims that, and I see it in the case of a dismissal, not just dismissal claims, but saying that we've breached our policy and any number of damages should result. So that's where I think we're headed, at least, or most folks should be headed to start with. On to the next slide, please. We've already talked about making sure that we have, again, all the basics. So if you move to the next slide, more considerations as you're drafting. And this goes to the type of work environment that you're in, right? Do we want a workplace-wide or a company-wide policy, or do we want position-specific features in the policy, right? So we should look at what we want this to look like and how we're messaging to different employees. If we want a company-wide policy, and if it's going to apply across Canada, keep in mind, we don't have legislative requirements like this outside of Ontario yet. Those may come. They may increase the requirements, of course, in the policy. And for federally regulated employers, we know from Avneet, we don't have any obligations yet. Those may come. But do we want it to apply, everybody under one branch, one policy, no differentiation between positions? Or do we want some form of position-specific policy where we say to the lawyers and we say to the executives and we say to our accountants, and et cetera, here are your rules, in particular, or make sure we call out, again, you serve a specific function that might be above and beyond the responsibilities of others. So yes, disconnecting from work means all of this, but we can make you no guarantees. Again, I'm not sure that we're going to be there just yet. You may have that in your policy drafted already, but I think at the front end, we want to be flexible. And I feel like many of us, as we go through the first 6 months of having this policy and rolling out this policy, might be a good time come January or June, 6 months to a year after we implement it, to calendar right now to do a review and look back and see what conversations were spurred by this policy and whether we need to tweak it and whether we are prepared to go with a company-wide policy or whether we need to add material to deal with specific positions or specific circumstances, and that general is not covering us enough. We want to be careful about creating policy rights, but I think, and I spoke to that a bit, but I think in particular on the policy, I think it will be important for us all to make sure we're clear on who's got responsibilities under this policy. At the top end, I think we need to make sure that there is someone or a group, maybe that's HR, maybe that's a specific person in HR, who's going to receive any complaints or concerns about the policy. Like I said, the government has already thought this is going to be iterative, and they're right. I think we're going to be facing employee questions. I think we're going to be facing employee concerns. And so it will be a good thing for us to have someone or some group who is able to keep an eye on this. And so when we do that review in 6 months, we do that review in a year, we see where the conflict points are and where maybe policy change isn't necessary, but maybe some cultural changes with managers, or maybe some cultural changes with respect to hours of work that we need to sort of focus in on as a company-wide or a department-specific initiative. So make sure that in our policy, we have something to say if there's concerns, questions, who to go to, right? Let's start information gathering on this. In terms of implementation too, one of the things I think might be a feature or a considerable feature for a lot of policies is putting this some responsibility on managers. You heard 2 weeks ago, the LifeWorks review suggested managers are contacting people after hours. And so maybe this policy is going to be a good opportunity for us to work with managers, people managers, to remind them, unless it's an emergency, unless it's absolutely necessary to engage with somebody after hours, we want to protect people's time off. And so under our policy, managers and employees should engage in a dialogue about what's going to be necessary and when. And, perhaps by way of doing that, we will see some improvement. The policy is quite flexible, but we'll see some improvement in that dialogue and the workflow and people having their time off. And so the numbers, those life work numbers in a year, look a little different because the manager is able to say, well, look, I was just emailing at 8 p.m. because it was convenient for me. I wasn't actually soliciting a response that night. You can do it tomorrow, when we work out ways to communicate around those expectations. On to the next slide, please. Of course, we're going to want to consider whether we're union or not union in this context. I still think at a high level, we're required to put in this policy. I don't expect, but we never know in a unionized context whether or not there'll be some grievance or issue raised by the union with respect to our policy, which I think is all the more reason to keep it to your base minimum requirements for now, unless you've got some other obligation under the collective agreement and obligations to consult under the collective agreement that you have. Non-union, of course, you've got the flexibility. The legislation just sets out the minimum pieces that need to be in there, and we can do it. Let's decide whether we're doing Ontario only or wider across Canada. And let's decide again, like, do we need to, at this point, is there ways for us to implement this policy, and maybe separately, little cheat sheet or little tips and tricks on how we can live up to a bit of a change, right? Can we talk about our email culture and whether or not we actually need people to be responding to emails at night? Can we talk about, when we're phoning people and why? And this can be a manager's only discussion. It doesn't have to necessarily be employee-wide, but these are things that either we can look at now, or as we're starting to hear complaints or see how this is being implemented on the ground and people have concerns, to look at, okay, it's pretty widespread. This email culture where managers are emailing and they don't need to be at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. at night and folks off hours or on weekends, etc. And understanding that some environments will have different requirements. Not everybody's working in a 9 to 5, of course. And so we want to make sure we're accounting for that and whatever policy we're dealing with. Not every employee is working the same shift or even the same shift every day or every week. And so we're making sure we're clear around expectations there. And we want to make sure that we're considering without necessarily having to set in stone what our regular hours of work are, right? So in our policy, disconnecting from work, if we're writing it up, we don't want to suggest everything is 9 to 5 when it's not. If we have a very flexible work environment, if we have shift work and 24-hour coverage, let's make sure we're keeping in mind all the little nuances and not writing something so granular that we could step off of what our actual work realities are. Next slide, the last piece, if you're on the next slide, if you are dealing with a unionized environment, trust me, they're live to this issue too. You've got some sample language here proposed by our friends at Unifor in some collective agreement negotiation, where the union wants in to discuss what the disconnecting from work policy is and wants to go further than that, create some very rigid rights. I'm not going to spend time reading this. The materials for today are going to be distributed, but you can see some very strict rights where the unions are trying to negotiate hard caps that after my shift is done, I should not have to answer an email, and you should not penalize me if I choose to ignore it. So on to the next slide. We've talked about base pieces that need to be in this policy, talked about some of the considerations, but here's the last piece I'm going to leave you all with, because I actually think of the 3 pieces: requirements, considerations, that this is the most important almost. It's about communication. Employees now, for some months since Bill 27 was introduced, have heard on the news and have heard through government speaking points about this new right to disconnect from work. We had the Minister of Labor, speaking from experience as somebody who was the director of policy to a Minister of Labor in the last Liberal government, I have some sense of what happens in the lead up to an election, and we all do. And it just so happens that employment standards are a hot topic and something that most Ontarians connect with. And so it's not surprising to me that we've seen this action and other action out of the Ministry of Labor, and that, in terms of political talking points, we've heard the Minister of Labor take a hard line and say, we're telling employers when people are off work, they're off work. That's enough, right? Just so happens that the legislation doesn't quite do what the Minister of Labor says it does or has been told it does. So we're heading into an election in Ontario. It wouldn't surprise me if these buzzwords about the right to disconnect get thrown around over the next month. The election starts tomorrow, and lo and behold, the policy needs to be implemented by June 2nd. So it's all going to be happening at the same time. So we should consider and make sure we have a considered approach on how we're going to deliver this to employees. And remember, we have to give a copy of this policy, whether it's online and drawn to their attention or in physical form, a note. We have to give this to employees in Ontario. So, we should be prepared to answer any questions, particularly if we've taken the approach I've suggested, which is flexible. It's not creating any absolute rights to disconnect from work, but sort of managing expectations. These are generally when we can contact you, or we will be contacting you outside of work. You may need to be around for operational reasons, and we're going to do our best otherwise to protect your time out. So you have to be ready to answer questions to that, because people will be getting some conflicting information, I think. In terms of managing employee expectations too, this again is why I think it's important to have in your policy somewhere they can go to deal with their issues, right? And maybe that's HR, where it says if you have any issues, you go to HR, so that the employees are not themselves sitting here thinking, I'm supposed to have the right to disconnect from work. And my manager, Avneet, has emailed me here at 9 p.m. So think about that, having a contact person to help work through it, and with a good set of Q&As around, well, our requirements are this is our policy, here's how we'll do it. And if there are issues, maybe we can work through it between you and your manager, but going forward and expectations. And then also be ready for litigation claims, right? If we've set hard and fast rules on disconnecting from work, if that's where we decide to go and not a flexible route, we've got to live up to it. On to the next slide. So we have to have a policy in Ontario. We may decide that we want to go and make that a Canada-wide, company-wide policy around disconnecting from work. But if we go to the next slide, let's ask ourselves, really, does the right to disconnect already exist? Have we lost the forest for the trees here? And in particular, in all the upheaval we've all been through over the last 2 years, changing our work landscape, where we went to a place where everyone was coming in offices to no longer coming in, and we don't have line of sight over when people are working necessarily and what they're doing. So we're going to spend just a few minutes to end off the presentation to talk about some of these considerations. And I think now is a good time, particularly in Ontario, as employees start thinking about and hearing about and talking about our policies and the rights to disconnect from work, and focusing on hours of work rights and entitlements, to take a look under our hood and make sure that we're following the rules, whether that's anybody who's got specific employment agreement rules or our employment standards minimums. So let's do that now and try to get ahead of it before employees start questioning, saying, not only did my manager do this, I think I'm owed for pay for answering an email on Saturday. Next slide. So let's talk what is work, just briefly, and particularly around disconnecting from work. I've talked to it, answering a late night email, taking a phone call on a Saturday, an early morning text, maybe. And with those come certain liabilities when we talk about pay, when we talk about overtime, when we talk about caps on hours of work in a week. And there are caps and there are expectations in our Employment Standards Act of how long employees are to have off in between their shifts. For example, in Ontario, we've got rules around 8 hours off or 11 hours off in a day that we need to be cognizant of. And we've switched to remote work. So when we're considering remote work and remote work policies, let's make sure that they're compliant with the time off requirements in our Employment Standards Acts across all provinces. On to the next slide. I won't spend any time on this, but what is work is actually defined in multiple locations, but in many it's not. And so anything that has to do, I would say to you generally, to the benefit of the employer, answering that email, taking that phone call, texting, sending you the text message to tell you what's going on, you might be creating some liability when somebody's doing that, particularly in a non-traditional hour piece. And we've had more and more people fall into that bracket. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vincent to talk a little bit too about existing hours of work limits.
So on the next slides, you'll see the key points when it comes to hours of work limits. you'll see that usually legislation in different provinces outline maximum hours of work in a week, periods of time that employees need to have off every week, and time off that they need to have between shifts. So in Ontario, for example, the maximum number of hours an employee should work in a day is 8, and a week is 48. In most cases, an employee needs to receive at least 11 consecutive hours off work each day. Generally, an employee and an employer cannot agree to less than 11 consecutive hours off work. The daily rest requirements applies even if the employer and the employee have agreed that the employee's hours of work will exceed the daily limit. Between shifts in Ontario, employees must receive at least 8 hours of work off. This does not apply if the total time worked on both shifts is not more than 13 hours. And unlike the daily limit, an employee can agree with an employer that the employee will receive less than 8 hours off between shift. Now, in the next slide, I give you the example of British Columbia. So in British Columbia, an employee must have at least 32 hours in a row free from work each week. If an employee works during this period, they usually have to be paid extra. They also have to have at least 8 hours off between shifts. If an employee works during this period, the hours are added to the hours worked in the day. This usually means that the employee must be paid overtime rates. BC is also a province that has double time, so you have to watch out for that. And with that, I'll leave it over to Avneet to discuss overtime.
Thank you, Vincent. So overtime is an important tool for employers to manage their workforce, manage their business operations, and especially useful during peak periods or increased productivity or requirements to meet customer needs. But it also is one of those things that has to be properly managed. And I'll very quickly go over the basic rules, overtime requirements, and you'll see it in the next slide. I'm not going to ask you to go yet to the next slide, Andrea, but that's there for you to understand the various limits. Every jurisdiction has their own limits on what constitutes overtime hours. And generally, I'll use Ontario as the example, legislated overtime thresholds are 44 hours. So any hour worked in excess of 44 will entail an enhanced payment requirement of generally 1.5 times your regular pay for every hour of overtime that's worked. And I think it's important to understand, and we'll talk a little bit about it as I go through the slides, but what employers really need to be mindful of when considering overtime is what does your existing policy or contract of employment define as overtime? And I say this because while there are legislative requirements, your employment contract or your policy might dictate a different requirement. And we'll see that later again in the case that I'm going to talk about. But if your contract of employment says that a regular work week is 40 hours and overtime is owed after every hour work beyond 40 hours, that's a greater right or benefit. And in that case, the ESA requirement, the employment standards legislated requirement won't prevail. It'll be the contract of employment. So you want to be mindful that you're following whatever policies or procedures that you already have set in place. And even another thing that I want employers to be mindful of is this concept of requiring prior approval. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about it when I speak to a case in the next slide. But generally, the idea here is that if an employee works overtime hours, regardless of whether there was prior approval required, generally the employee will be entitled to that pay. And it's important to ensure that managers and supervisors appropriately track and document hours of work and prevent any unauthorized overtime hours from being worked if that is the policy in place at the workplace. And this goes on to my next point of document. This is so important, especially in today's environment where we have people working from home more often than not, and it's becoming more and more difficult to track employee hours. So it's very important that you build in mechanisms in place that you can then have your own record to show the actual hours worked. And I say this because you can have a situation where somebody comes to you and says, I've been logging my hours at home, I work this much overtime. And if you don't have a record to contradict that or to show otherwise, and then the employee challenges and takes this to, whether it's the tribunal at the Employment Standards Branch or litigates this, generally their record will likely prevail if you have nothing to contradict their evidence with. So it's really important that you have something in place to demonstrate that. And I had actually a recent case where an employee, it was exactly that. It was a COVID time. Employee was working from home and came back and they ended up being terminated without cause during that time, and came back and said, I have 150 hours of unpaid overtime over the last 2 years. And the employer had no way of verifying whether that was true or not true. And it ended up being a situation that we settled outside before it went any further. But essentially, we had to negotiate and take for face value that this person had these records of working these hours on an internal log that they had tracked themselves. And it was something that became a part of the settlement. So if overtime is a key element of your business operations, you want to consider you might even want to consider overtime averaging agreements, which can be helpful to track overtime and make it easier to limit when it's required, and it's a good tool to better manage. But those are just some certain things that I want to just make sure. And I'm going to go a little bit into detail about some of the implications that could come out of not having a proper policy or tracking procedure when it comes to overtime hours. So I'll just quickly go over to the next slide. I'm not going to go into detail. It's there available for you, but it basically goes into all the jurisdictions in Canada and speaks to the various overtime thresholds and the amounts that are owed when those thresholds are reached. And again, these are the legislative requirements. If your policy or contract of employment speaks otherwise, and so long as it's equal to or greater than what is required from legislation, then that is what's going to prevail. So on to the next slide. So this was a case, it's a famous case. I apologize if any of you have already followed it. It was very well documented in the news, but it's the infamous decision of Fresco versus CIBC. And it was a long-standing case. It took 12 years in litigation, but essentially it was a class action that involved over 31,000 frontline bank employees who had worked between the period of February 1993 and June 2009. And the main issue in this case was whether or not the bank's overtime policies and record-keeping systems violated the Canada Labour Code, and which resulted then in unpaid overtime, so essentially a breach of contract. The litigation commenced when Dara Fresco, the representative and plaintiff, brought a proposed class action against CIBC for unpaid overtime in 2007 for that relevant period that I just mentioned. And we'll just go on to the next slide. And essentially, the issue was whether or not the policies that were in place contravened the Canada Labour Code. And the Canada Labour Code provision that was in question here was under section 174 of the code, which stated where an employee is required or permitted to work in excess of the standard hours of work, the employee shall be paid for the overtime at a rate of wages not less than 1 1/2 times their regular rate of pay. So that's how the legislation defined overtime requirements and entitlements. The policy, though, the bank's policy was that an employee regular work week consisted of 7.5 hours per day or 37.5 hours per week. So here's a situation where the policy in place had provided a greater right or benefit. So essentially here, if an employee worked more than 37.5 hours, they would be entitled to overtime pay, whereas the legislation required it after 40 hours. So another issue in here was that the fact that the CIBC had policies, and the policies generally, there was two issues that came into play. And one was the fact that the policy required pre-approval in order for overtime to be paid out. And there was also another element of the policy that was introduced a little later on during the relevant period. But essentially it said that post approval could be obtained, but only in exceptional circumstances and provided that it was obtained as soon as possible. So essentially what the issue here was whether these policies contravened the Canada Labor Code, and the court found that yes, they did. Overtime hours that were permitted but not authorized under policies would not be paid out. And this was contrary to the code because, as I just mentioned, the code states that where employees required or permitted to work, overtime shall be paid, whereas the policies required pre-approval or post-approval only in extenuating circumstances. So this did not align with what the legislation stated. And so in essence, it resulted in a violation of the Canada Labor Code. And further, another issue that was in question here is that the record keeping wasn't, again, in compliance with the Canada Labor Code. So employees were not properly being compensated for overtime. So essentially what happened was a massive class action and a lot of liability for the bank for these issues. So as I said, the court ruled in favor of the class action members. So, and another important distinction was that the court decided that not every single member of the class action was required to demonstrate that they in fact had worked overtime or owed compensation. So that was another key point that basically essentially was detrimental to the bank. And so I think one good takeaway from this is to understand and really, hone home the point that you want to make sure your policies are properly drafted. You want to ensure that you're properly documenting, properly tracking. And I think one important nuance is that there's this decision. And I think one thing that we want to make sure we take away is that this doesn't mean that you cannot have a policy that requires pre-approval. I think that's not what this case is saying. There's nothing wrong with an overtime policy that proposes pre-authorization. The key difference is that you want to ensure that the policy doesn't go as far as to say that those are preconditions for payment. Because like I mentioned before, if an employee works overtime or is permitted to work overtime, then they are owed overtime regardless of whether pre-approval was obtained. And so I think that's the nuance that you want to make sure when you're drafting these policies that is taken into consideration. The court also, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, happy to address questions offside if they come up, but essentially the idea is that, and the key word that came up in this case was this concept of permitted. And I think and there was a lot of discussion on what that definition means. And really what it comes down to is permitted can be not prevented. So even though you're requiring authorization, if you or your managers know that employees may be working overtime or there's nothing that's being done to actually, expressly prevent the overtime from being from worked, then essentially it could be argued that the company kind of, either turned a blind eye or allowed the overtime to occur. So that's, I think, that one distinction that is important to take away from this case. But all in all, it comes down to, again, just making sure that you're properly documenting, keeping appropriate records. And really, again, in the time of COVID, I know it's really, really hard because you have employees that are not in the workplace, they're at home, it becomes harder and harder to track hours. So I think this is more and more important. To Marc's point, if an employee is working 40 hours a week or 44 hours a week, and then they go on and answer an email on the weekend for 20 minutes, does that all of a sudden trigger the overtime threshold? And so these are all things you want to be mindful of and maybe, really brainstorm on and understand of how to track and maintain and manage the workforce and ensuring that employees are working the appropriate hours and that the company is meeting the legislative requirements when it comes to these rest periods, overtime requirements, and hours of work thresholds. Okay, I'm going to pass it on to now Vincent.
And so we have two other cases for you that you may be interested in. The first one is Baroque versus Canada Cartage. So in this case, this was also a class action about unpaid overtime and faulty record keeping. So in this case, the plaintiff alleged that Canada Cartage, as a matter of policy or practice, only paid overtime if the 60-hour threshold was exceeded, that it had no written policy on overtime, no directive for its human resources staff, and no centralized record-keeping system. It also alleged that overtime eligibility determinations were made on a case-by-case basis in complete disregard of applicable laws, and that when Canada Cartage was directed by federal labor authorities to comply with the prescribed overtime threshold, it unilaterally reduced the hourly wage in the affected areas so that it would appear that the required overtime was being paid when it really wasn't. Now, the defendant came back and explained that it was, it operated two separate businesses that they called East and West. They each had different payroll records and practices, dozens of different job positions with different responsibility, multiple terminals, etc., which is why the record keeping obligations were so messy. Now, it's important to notice here that the settlement was of 22.25 million. And the reason why that's relevant is because the expert reports presented damage calculations that ranged from a low of 3 million to a high of 45, and that the 22.25 million settlement actually fell in the middle of the range and about 7 million more than the highest amount presented by the experts for the defendant. And so there is no doubt that the faulty records were a major factor in this instance. And this comes back to what Avneet said about keeping documents. You must have documents. If not, you may end up paying for it later. And this is also the case this is also an important fact for the next case that I'm going to talk about, which is on the next slide. It's the matter of Jong versus Kim's Marc's Corporation. Now, this case is even more interesting because in this case, the employee filed a complaint with the Director of Labor, claiming that he was entitled to wages for work he had performed. The employer didn't have any records whatsoever. But you know who did? Well, the employee. They weren't great records. They were simply little notes in a diary, but they were the only records available. And sure enough, the court concluded that the Director of Employment Standards was right to rely on these handwritten scribble notes that the employee presented and that were admitted into evidence. And so if you don't keep good records, your employees might, and you may, like Kim's Marc's Corporation, be on the receiving end of a $29,000 order. And so we cannot encourage you enough to keep written records. And I'll hand it over to Marc to close it off.
I'm going to give it to Avneet one last time. But before I do, there is one thing I want to draw attention to, and this builds on Vincent's last case, particularly for those of us that have switched to a model where folks work from home and we can't see line of sight where there's a regular 9 to 5 day. People show up, we are expecting them to show up. We step in if there's tardiness, and then everybody clocks out at 5 o'clock. And in the context of online, where we don't have that line of sight, I have seen cases now where employees who are not exempt from overtime, and we'll get to this, that these are big numbers and scary cases, I know, and there'll be many people who are going to be exempt from these rules. The traditional folks who we always, have had the ability to go to in a pinch or call, and they're exempt from hours of work requirements. But those who are not, I've had cases where the employees have simply sat there and on a piece of paper written down all of their hours in a week, and then lo and behold, once they've reached a certain threshold, they send it into the employer and say, oh, by the way, I've worked 200 hours of overtime, and I'd like my overtime, please. So these are challenges for us in a remote work environment where, historically it doesn't make sense. We haven't asked people to keep track of their hours, and we maybe aren't using technology that tracks the sign in, sign out, or we haven't communicated that these are the hours expectations, which is always a good idea to say we expect people, especially the ones that are not overtime exempt, to log in at 9 and to log out at 5. To manage overtime claims that we've seen these happen now. So over to Avneet to talk about one more issue, and we'll wrap it up and do a bit of Q&A.
Thanks, Marc. So I'm mindful of the time. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but just a reminder of the concept of call-in pay. And it essentially is an entitlement where employees are ensured a certain amount of pay if they report for work outside their normal scheduled hours, to receive a minimum compensation, regardless of how much work is performed. And generally the idea, and I'll use Ontario as the example, is an employee who generally works more than 3 hours shift. So if an employee who normally works an 8-hour shift is required to come in on, say, Friday and for the regular shift, but there's a downturn in production or there's an issue and then they're sent home, they're entitled to a minimum of 3 hours pay. The only thing I want to say in this section is that every jurisdiction has different rules with respect to this. So you want to be mindful of that, especially if you have operations in different provinces. The other thing is the difference between call-in pay and being on call. An employee who's generally on standby or on call, but away from the workplace, and it's just required to be accessible to the employer when needed. Generally speaking, that time is not considered work time, unless, of course, they end up performing work during that time. In which case, then, all call-in provisions will be triggered, or regular work time pay provisions will be triggered. Some employers may provide, as a greater right or benefit, on-call pay just to be available, in which case, then that rule or policy would prevail. Even if the employee doesn't work, and if the employee starts to work, then again, the regular hours of work wage requirements would be triggered. So that's really all I want to say with respect to this piece. If you have any specific questions, happy to address them after, but I do want to, mindful of the time, and I know we have a bunch of questions, and so I want to get to those and make sure we address as many questions as we can. So I'm just going to conclude here, and Marc, I'll pass it over to you, and then we'll get to the questions.
So again, keep in mind, that all of the employment standards legislation we're talking about, you may have greater entitlements already in policies in terms of time off or call-in pay or standby pay that exists. But historically, all of these provisions, these statutes in every province and at the federal jurisdiction, they were crafted with a different world of work in mind than the one that we see now in many cases, right? They were crafted, if you're working in an environment, and many of you are, I know, which has hourly employees, hourly paid employees and associates who have to report to a physical work environment, well, these rules fit a lot nicer into that bracket. Where we've now seen a more flexible work and work from home and different hours of work, where employees and employers are fine and choosing to work 5 hours in the morning, take a nice long break, and then work 5 hours in the evening, and change the model out of what these sort of tightly wound boxes are meant to cover, then we can run into issues. Some employees across all the provinces, they all have their own different exemptions, but some are going to be exempt. Again, your managers, your executives, the folks that traditionally we've always needed to have on call in case of emergency or for directions and all that, for the most part, they are going to be exempt from these rules. You're going to want to check and make sure you're applying the rules appropriately. For example, oftentimes we get asked, are store managers for the purposes of employment standards? And I will warn you that often they are not, especially I can tell you, for example, in Ontario, because oftentimes store managers are doing not only their managerial duties, but they're doing the same duties as the people they manage. So managing the cash, putting out the stock, dealing with customers, that they are not actually in a managerial exemption. And so we want to be careful about how we're applying the exemptions and making sure we're applying them right. But for everyone else, especially if we're faced with working from home, now's a good time, as the talk is going to rise about disconnecting from work and hours, and employees are going to be thinking about this some more over the next months. Let's look at how has our workplace changed. We've had to make changes quickly. We haven't probably had time to breathe and think about the long-term implications for ourselves. So if they're doing remote or flex work for the first time, or we've established our company that way, have there been changes where we need to make sure we're still on side of employment standards wherever we're operating? Do we have requirements about keeping a record on hours of work? And for many of us, we wouldn't have. I'll use Ontario as an example again. So if we had a situation where employees had the same schedule every week, 9 to 5, there's some exemptions around having to keep records of employees' hours of work. But if because of the pandemic or a work change, we've decided we're going to go to flex work environments and employees can choose when to log in and log off as long as they get the work done, and the rules around hours of work apply to them, well, we may actually have some obligations to keep records. So what does that look like, and how can we practically keep records of employee hours of work? Have we communicated to employees what their hours of work should look like, so we're staying on side of employment standards rules as well, where those rules apply to them? Are we compliant with our overtime issues? Are we compliant with the hours off in a week? So when we talk again about, a policy about the right to disconnect, I think we should keep in mind, and we hope you take from this presentation, we should keep in mind that some of these, some actual concrete rights to disconnect to not answer emails or engage in work potentially already exist. And although we haven't maybe had to pay them much attention, now that this is a growing area of focus for everyone, maybe now is a good time for us to get ahead and just make sure that whatever work environment we have now, we're on side with these hours off and overtime and pay for doing work on off days rules potentially, because we want to avoid claims and we want to avoid creating new law, I think, in this space. So why don't we, with the time we have left, I know that you've sent through a number of questions for us. Vincent, with your topic, why don't we start here? With your topic, we've got a question around proof around hours of work. You've talked about the log that the employee took. Well, what do you think about an employee who sends an email after hours? So we've got the email as proof. Could they use that to say, well, I spent a half hour preparing this email, and so that half hour in sending the email is my proof of hours of work? What do you think?
I think they could definitely use it. I think it, they'll have it to make things work. We've seen some employees, send their correspondence to the personal emails and then bring those up later on. So no, definitely, if somebody sends an email at night, they may be CCing or BCCing their personal email for some reason to bring that back later on. So no, definitely, it's important to keep very good records of, and to ensure that, if the employee does have proof, to know that proof may come out later, for sure.
Great. We had another question about, if we're in Ontario and we have to create this new disconnecting from work policy, should we put that into or merge it into our existing hours of work policy? So I'll answer this one to say that you could. My suggestion, at least though, at an early stage with this brand new policy that's legislatively required, we don't have to have a policy about hours of work. Obviously, it's not a bad idea to have one to manage everyone's expectations. My suggestion, though, is let's keep this as a standalone policy for now, because this policy can actually be looked at by the Ministry of Labor. And as we wait to see how employees react, as we wait to see how the government reacts here, let's keep that separate, because again, if the Ministry of Labor comes around, gets called in, an employee makes a complaint, whether or not it's founded, right? The Ministry of Labor is going to say to us, I want to see your policy on disconnecting from work. And if that policy is merged into your hours of work policy, well, you're going to be handing over the whole thing. And I know that we, on the advice and warnings of Fasken, you will have taken a look at that policy and made sure you're absolutely on side with the law. But let's imagine, heaven forbid, you're not. And you've handed over a policy now over to the regulator where there is some issue in it. And guess what happens then? You may have had the policy for disconnecting from work and you'd be absolutely good with that. But now the Ministry of Labor inspector is seeing a problem over here, and their investigation and their issue with you turns into something very different. So my suggestion is, as we wait to see how this works out, that you keep the policy separate and communicate it separately, and have it as a standalone going forward. Avneet, I've got a question for you, and this is in respect to overtime. We've had somebody ask, if I've communicated to an employee not to work overtime unless I approve it, and they work it anyway, like what's my recourse here?
So that question does come up, and generally what happens is if they've worked it anyways, I would have a conversation, and there's two separate issues here. One, the violation of the policy. So you can sit down and have a conversation and do whatever you need to do from a coaching disciplinary aspect with respect to violating the policy. But if they've worked those hours, then they're likely entitled to that pay. So while they would still get paid for it, you can still manage expectations and compliance with workplace policies, and possibly take steps in to prevent that from happening. So, for example, this is easier when you have a physical workplace and you're seeing the employee physically in front of you working, and you can stop them and say, "Hey, you already worked 8-hour shift. Your shift is done," and that there. It's obviously much harder to manage when it's a work from home arrangement or the person is not physically in front of you. But again, like I said, then you'd manage this in two different aspects. One being the non-compliance of the policy issue, and the second, you'd have, the requirement to actually pay the time worked.
Great, great. Vincent, how about this? In the event, so we've got an employer who's got a union, the collective agreement is midstream, it's continuing on at past June 2, 2022. Are we still required to have a disconnecting from work policy by that time if we have more than 25 employees?
No, so absolutely. The legislation is very clear that if as of January 1st of this year, you had 25 employees, by June 2nd, you need to have a disconnection policy that meets the requirement that you Marc covered earlier. There's no exception as far as we're aware.
Okay. Avneet, here again on disconnecting from work policies, a question about, do I have to give this policy if I've got hourly plant employees or employees who don't have emails, like we don't email with them ever? Do I need to give them a copy of our disconnecting from work policy?
Yeah, short answer.
There's also a question about whether you've got to give it to temp agency workers. Now, I would tell you typically under the Employment Standards Act, the temp agency workers, it's recognized that the employer is actually the temp agency. So the temp agency should be giving them, if they've got more than 25 employees, and it applies, and this requirement applies to them in Ontario, the temp agency should be giving the employees the temp agency's disconnecting from work policy. Now, you again, as you're contracting with temp agencies, you may want to make sure that you've got your obligations set out in your contracts with the temp agency, that they're going to abide by all requirements, including, if it applies to them, giving these employees their policy around disconnecting from work. There was another question too about, does the disconnecting from work policy, do we have to give it to contractors? The short answer on that is no. If we're using anyone who is an actual contractor in Ontario, so not an employee at law, and that is sometimes in question, but if we absolutely have a contractor, contractors do not fall under the Ontario Employment Standards Act. It is only employees. So for that purposes, we don't need to give them a policy at all. There was a question too about whether this applies to students on a practicum. So it depends. There are some exemptions to the ESA for students. So you're going to want to double check and make sure that you fall into one of those exemptions. If not, then yes, they get the policy as well. Here's a question for you, Vincent. What about, and I know we touched on it briefly, but what about managers who I need to have 24/7? How am I supposed to deal with them in a disconnecting from work policy?
Right. So if you do want to carve out exceptions in your policy, you're entitled to do so. But your policy does have to apply to all employees. It can apply differently to all employees, but it must apply to all employees. And so if you have employees like managers that are expected to answer questions at any time, any day, you should, in my opinion, write that in your policy, or at least communicate it in some way through the policy to the employees that are concerned. And this is not only true of managers, but any other employees that you may have, like professionals or whoever, that you do need to have on call.
And I'd just like to add to that, is you also want to be mindful of, again, like we talked about, the existing obligations that already exist under Employment Standards Act. So if a manager is exempt from hours of work thresholds, then their obligations under the policy or their entitlements under the policy might be different than an employee who is not exempt. So just things that you want to be mindful of when drafting policies, and especially when policies differ between the class of the employee in the workforce.
So there's a question we have as well in terms of overtime. So the question here, Avneet, I'll send it to you first. So if somebody is working overtime on a weekend because they're answering a couple of calls and they work 15 minutes, but it's past the overtime threshold, and we'll agree for our purposes it's work. How much overtime? The question is, do they have to be paid an hour and a half, 1.5 hours of overtime? And this is only for 15 minutes of overtime.
So it's for every hour that's worked. So that would be 1.5, the amount of time worked, it would be 1.5 times their rate of pay for that amount of time.
Yeah. So for this question, for some the individual who sent this question into us, they only need to be paid for 15 minutes of overtime, right? So it's really 22 22 and a half minutes.
Yeah.
1.5 times. They don't need to be paid a full hour and a half if they only work 15 minutes.
Yeah. That's correct. These are good questions.
Yeah, and we'll do a few more here. I know that we're about a minute out, but we'll do just a couple more. And I know that there's a few others, but I think we're capturing a lot. So here's a question, Vincent. You talked a lot about European requirements. So how should I approach if I'm situated in Canada or Ontario and I employ someone who's working out of France or Italy? What obligations do I have with them with respect to disconnecting from work?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do if you have an employee who's working in a different jurisdiction is get a legal opinion on the laws of that jurisdiction, because you'll often have employment legislation that clearly state that you cannot contract out of them. And so that'd be the first thing that I would do.
I think that's right. Just to build on that. So employment law in Canada is very jurisdiction specific. You're either federally regulated or provincially regulated, and your employees are typically going to be regulated by the province in which they do work. If you also employ employees in another jurisdiction, they're likely bound to the laws of that jurisdiction. So you'll find yourself having to abide by, say, the French requirements about disconnecting from work, or the Italian requirements, or the requirements in Sweden or wherever you're employing somebody. So we'd encourage you to seek local counsel. We work with clients all the time to source them some local counsel to discuss those employment issues. Now, in terms of giving employees a copy of the policy, Avneet, what if we work in a completely digital environment and I'm supposed to give them a copy of the policy? What are some practical solutions on that?
So yeah, you can absolutely email them a copy. I would just ensure some form of confirming and documenting that copy was received, and whether it's an acknowledgement or something of that sort. But yes, absolutely, it can be electronically shared, just as long as each individual is receiving a copy and has access to that copy.
I would just add on that by saying that if you are emailing it to your employees, do not BCC all your employees, because you're risking of starting an email chain on the content of the policy. Use the BCC function instead.
A smart idea. You might learn very quickly where some cultural, workplace culture and workplace conflict on hours of work might already exist when this goes out. And that goes back to the idea of putting the policy together is required if you're in Ontario. And if you're deciding to do it elsewhere, obviously putting it together is only one piece of the whole puzzle. When you decide to publish it and go live, you've got to be ready to implement it and live up to what's in there. And you've got to communicate it in a way that, you hope that it lands well and creates some positive buzz, but you're prepared for the negative buzz and the negative feedback that might come. Just a few more pieces, and then we'll just wrap up. And I'm just going to do these in a bit of rapid fire for us. If you're in a business that has no fixed hours of work because of flexible schedules, that's okay. What you want to do, I think, is make sure that you have done your diligence and we're abiding by our local employment standards rules. So for exempt individuals who I don't need to worry about hours of work, and I don't need to worry about the on-call pay requirements and all that, great. You've got full flexibility with those employees. For employees who are not exempt, maybe it's a good idea to take a look and see what those rules are and see whether or not we need to tweak how flexible we really can be in the work schedule if we want to mitigate the risk of an employee having a problem or a Ministry of Labor personnel having a problem. I'm going to give you an example of this. We know in our tech sector, most employees, many of them want flexibility. They want the ability to do the job when they want to do it. They want the ability to come and go and to get the projects done as the projects needs to be done. Many of them may be subject to an exemption, but many are not. And so it's not infrequent that we'll see the Ministry of Labor go do a spot check in that sector in particular and say, you're offside. It's all great for the employee and the employer to agree, I'm going to work on a flexible work schedule, but you can't actually contract out of the ESA in Ontario, and you can't contract out of it elsewhere. The various provincial and federal pieces of legislation too. So maybe we want to take a quick look under the hood. Where we've got employees working in different jurisdictions and we need, somebody working in the Eastern time zone to talk to somebody in the Pacific time zone, same ideas, right? Like, let's just make sure that we've got our workflow and our work hours and our exemptions figured out such that we're not going to have a problem in the future. And I'm going to end on this, perhaps. There's a question about, and I'll say this, there's lots of flexibility about what can be in the policies. What makes sense for you may not make sense for another. So if you want to have policies for hourly employees versus salaried, we can do that. But one of the questions was, can you write this policy such that it's just one sort of big exemption, right? Like, again, that the so-called right to disconnect or disconnecting from work is a loose value, but is not a commitment. And the short answer to that is yes, right? Going back to this policy, we have got no obligations to create any new employee rights to actually disconnect from work other than what already exists. So if at the end of the day, this is a very high level policy that, at its core is about values of trying our best to protect people's time off, that's enough. That, to me, meets the legislative requirements. And when the Ministry of Labor comes calling, you'll be able to show them, I do have a policy about disconnecting for work and it's aspirational. The one thing I will warn you about, though, is that, again, this was going to be iterative, because you can bet, I think we should all be prepared for discussions to start coming up about workplace culture and hours of work and employees' expectations around time off, because this is something new. This is not a buzzword. This is here to stay. And so we should be prepared to discuss it. With that said, lots to talk about. Surely, another window for those in Ontario or those looking to match the Ontario obligations, about a month to get our policies in place. So I want to thank you all for coming and joining us today. Also, I want to thank Vincent and Avneet as well for sharing their insights. If you haven't filled out our survey yet, please do. You should have been given a link to do so, and we appreciate the feedback from you. It certainly helps us here at Fasken model our next sessions on topics that are relevant to you and for all of our businesses. And I want to remind you that we do have our next session actually coming up. It's on May 17th. The session is It's Okay to Say Gay in the Workplace, examining workplace issues for the 2S LGBTQIA community. We encourage you all to visit the Fasken Institute on fasken.com to register. And if you're not following us yet, to get our weekly and monthly bulletins about important news items, the HR space, you can find links to sign up for that as well on fasken.com. And with that, we thank you for staying with us, going a little over time, and wish you all a great afternoon. Thanks for joining.